German Chancellor Olaf Scholz discussed the restoration of peace in Europe over the phone with President-elect Donald Trump. This was reported by federal government advisor Stefan Gebestreit. According to him, on Sunday evening, Olaf Scholz spoke on the phone with Donald Trump, congratulated him once again in person on his election victory, and the two discussed German-American relations and current geopolitical challenges. The Chancellor emphasized the federal government's willingness to continue the successful cooperation between the governments, and they also agreed to work together to restore peace in Europe. Donald Trump has recently talked to many people, primarily about restoring peace on the European continent. On Thursday, Trump said that he had not spoken to Putin after announcing his victory in the presidential election, but he allowed such a conversation. Yesterday, The Washington Post reported that Trump did talk to the Russian dictator. Probably on the 7th, Trump asked Putin not to escalate in Ukraine. Against this background, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine stated that reports that Kyiv had been informed in advance of a telephone conversation between U.S. President-elect Donald Trump and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin were not true. This was reported by Reuters with reference to the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Georgy Tiki. According to him, reports that the Ukrainian side was informed in advance about this call are false, so Ukraine could neither support nor oppose this conversation. Against this backdrop, whether Putin talked to Trump or Trump talked to Putin, the American president's calls were heard. I was convinced that we shouldn't escalate, and on Monday, today, our Air Force reported that 8 Tu-95 MS planes took off from Russia and subsequently launched cruise missiles. In general, the Air Force wrote that there are 8 Tu-95 MS aircraft in the air, heading in the direction of the launch borders of the Caspian Sea, and that they will report any changes in the situation promptly. At the same time, they urged people not to ignore air raid warnings. As of 7:30 a.m., the Air Force reported the launch of cruise missiles by Russian bombers. The air alert is related to the launch of these missiles from Tu-95 MS strategic bombers from the Caspian Sea. As soon as we have more detailed information, but we hope not, we will update you. Emergency power outages have been introduced in a number of regions due to the threat of Russian strikes on the energy sector. On November 11th at 6:31 a.m., emergency power outages were recorded in Cherkasy region at the command of NPC Ukrenergo. Measures have been taken to preserve our country's energy system. Due to the threat of a missile strike, Kyiv has introduced emergency power outage schedules. This is a preventive measure. Stay calm. In Sumy region, emergency blackout schedules from the first to the fourth stage have been introduced, and the media generally report on emergency blackouts in Mykolaiv, Zhytomyr, Kirovohrad, and Kharkiv regions. Biden's national security advisor Jake Sullivan said in an interview with CBS that the U.S. President Joe Biden will continue to talk about the need to support Ukraine until the end of his term in office. Sullivan noted that the approach of the current president's administration in recent days remains the same, as it has been for the past 2.5 years. To put Ukraine in a stronger position on the battlefield so that it can take a stronger position at the negotiating table. Biden's advisor confirms that the administration will strive to use all resources allocated by Congress before the end of its term. President Biden will have the opportunity over the next 70 days to make the case that the United States should not withdraw from Ukraine, that withdrawal from this country means even more instability in Europe. At the same time, Sullivan refused to say whether he was referring to any specific legislative proposal to finance Ukraine. Biden will argue that we need permanent resources for Ukraine after his term expires, because the threat to Ukraine will remain regardless of what happens on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. The United States plans to send Ukraine interceptor missiles for the Patriot air defense system, as well as NASAMS, which should be enough for our country until the end of the year. It is about more than $7 billion, which will allow the Pentagon to transfer weapons and ammunition to Ukraine from its stockpiles. Unspent funds of over $2 billion to finance long-term contracts for equipment supply for Kyiv. By providing our country with as much military assistance as possible until January, i.e., when Trump is inaugurated, Biden administration officials hope to strengthen Ukraine's position in negotiations and strengthen our defense capabilities. Before the election, the administration aimed to deliver the rest of the aid to Ukraine by April. After the presidential election in the United States, this timeline has gained new relevance. The Pentagon is preparing to send more than 500 more interceptors to Ukraine for the Patriot and NASAMS missile defense systems in response to the intensification of Russian attacks. These supplies should satisfy Ukraine's air defense needs by the end of the year. On Friday, the Biden administration said it would send a large number of contractors to help Ukraine repair and maintenance of F-16 fighters and other systems provided by the United States for our country. The contractors will work far from the front line to ensure their safety. More and more systems began to fail due to the lack of qualified workers to repair and maintain them. That's one thing. And two, in order to repair something, you have to first pull it away from the front line, and not just pull it to the rear, but also load it on trawlers, load it on trains, send it to the European Union for repair there, then bring it back to the distribution hub, and then take it back to the front. It takes too much time. So finally, the Biden administration took this step, and American contractors are to arrive in our country in the coming months to repair and maintain the equipment here. The impact of the planned increase in arms supplies, in particular, we are talking about air defense equipment, which is a matter of great concern. The United States is considering options such as buying weapons from other countries to give them to Ukraine, rather than removing or taking something from its own stockpiles. Ukrainian officials, according to the Wall Street Journal, insist on providing additional tactical missile systems to the army, claiming that such systems will allow strikes far beyond Russia's front line. The Pentagon has been reluctant to send additional systems, arguing that the Russian Federation has moved aircraft to other valuable targets beyond range, and the Biden administration has refused to allow Ukrainian forces to use missiles to strike at the territory of the Russian Federation itself, although it seems as if they were waiting, because as soon as the talk of that Ukraine could theoretically receive missiles that would strike at the territory of the Russian Federation, the Russian occupiers moved their military bases, aircraft, and even ships out of the range of these missiles. Meanwhile, the UK government is considering possible options in the context of President-elect Donald Trump's approach to Ukraine, as stated by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, on Sky News. According to him, he assured that in view of Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. elections, Britain will not abandon its commitment to support Ukraine and said, "That's why we are offering Ukraine £3 billion a year," which, as you know, in the financial context here in Britain, is a difficult but right decision. Let me remind you that the figure of £3 billion of support for Ukraine for 2024 was set by the previous Conservative government under Rishi Sunak. According to Jones, British officials will be considering and planning for many different scenarios of what they would do under any administration in the United States, because they need to make sure that Britain is in the strongest position. As you know, during the election campaign, Trump said that he would find a solution to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, but did not explain how he would do it. According to the Wall Street Journal, Trump's entourage, in order to fulfill his promise to quickly suspend the war in Ukraine, is talking about freezing the front along the current line, which should also include a demilitarized zone, and a 20-year moratorium on Ukraine's acceptance or accession to NATO. This plan envisages that the defense and protection of Ukraine will be carried out not by the American military, but by the European Union troops, which means troops from Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and so on, and they are supposed to be stationed along the entire length of the front line. The Americans won't allocate a single cent for this, but are ready to provide Ukraine with weapons against the Russian Federation. Let us emphasize once again that Donald Trump has not yet commented on how exactly and what plan he adopted. And all we know is that he called Putin and asked him not to escalate, but then asked him not to escalate. As we know, the Russians have launched 145 drones across the territory, and today 8 Tu-95 MS aircraft took off. This is a kind of request if it was really made. After a massive drone attack against Ukraine, a second drone was found in northern Moldova yesterday. The drone was found near the village of Boroseni Noi in the Rishkin district of Moldova, and law enforcement officers fenced off the area around the crash site. The Moldovan police provided new details about the first drone that went down in the Kauzeni district. And they write that after the initial examination, it was found that it was a Shahed-type drone, Russian-made and did not contain any explosives. Previously, it was part of a wave of drone strikes that Ukraine suffered last night. Moldovan Foreign Minister Mihai Popshoy condemned the violation of the country's airspace by Russian drones, endangering Moldovan citizens. He also said that 2 decoy drones used to mislead Ukrainian air defense had crashed in Moldova, and according to the minister, this endangered the lives of Moldovan citizens and violated the country's airspace. He said, "We strongly condemn these aggressive incursions and reiterate our condemnation of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine." Of course, we thank you for your condemnation, but something needs to be done about it, because more and more often, Russian drones are flying into the territory of other countries. This time it was decoy drones, but it may be that they will not be decoy drones, but drones with a warhead, as has already happened in different countries. In particular, in Poland, there are discussions about whether to shoot down Russian drones, in particular, those that enter the country's airspace, even if they are heading to the territory of Ukraine. And the main nuance is that North Atlantic Alliance weapons will be used to shoot down such drones, which makes the NATO member country a party to the war. There is no decision yet, nor is there permission to shoot down non-NATO weapons. But many countries are afraid of being drawn into this war, which is why air threats that fly to the west of our country through European states or through Western countries are not shot down, but simply observed, then tried to be found, including by horseback, helicopters, on foot, in the forests to no avail, and then it turns out that nothing may have happened, or maybe no one flew in. These are, let's say, excuses. And so far, fortunately, none of the citizens of our friends and partners have been injured. But it can happen because the Russians have not stopped launching their air threats across our country and through, for example, European countries. So sooner or later it will come to this, because there is a saying that goes, once a year the stick fires. So we are working to prevent this from happening. These threats need to be neutralized, possibly on the territory of our country. But even this option is not yet considered. At the very end of this news hour, I would like to remind you that Channel 24 has a fundraiser for 380,000 UR for a Mercedes Sprinter for the Shaman Special Unit, the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, a special unit that performs specific tasks in different parts of our front line. In fact, this vehicle will be very useful to them, allowing transport of people, ammunition, provisions, and evacuation of the wounded. And you can evacuate several people at once, and maybe even transport some interesting surprises for the Russians. Our defenders will figure out how to use the vehicle themselves. The main thing is to raise funds. We have already raised 14% of the UAH 380,000. We are grateful for support. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screens or by going to fund.24tv.ua and doing it there. Thank you in advance. Any contribution is extremely important. Our President, Volodymyr Zelensky, noted that Russian military targets are becoming more and more accessible to Ukrainian forces. He said, "First of all, I would like to thank our soldiers who ensure our drone strikes. Everyone sees drones on the front line and our long-range drones deep in the Russian rear. Russian military facilities are becoming more and more accessible to our soldiers. I am grateful to the SSU and the Special Operations Forces. Russian military warehouses, airfields, and their military industrial complexes will not hide." Zelensky thanked those who destroy Russian equipment. In particular, the Security Services Special Forces have destroyed more than 1,300 Russian tanks. 8th Russian tank destroyed by Ukraine attributed to SBU. As you know, in terms of long-range strikes, on Sunday night, Ukrainian drones hit the ammunition depots of the 160th Logistics Center. This is the former 120th arsenal of the main missile and artillery directorate of the Russian Federation in the Bryansk region. In addition, on the same night, the Russian authorities claimed that 34 Ukrainian drones were shot down in the Moscow region at night. Meanwhile, the commander of the British Armed Forces, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, said in an interview with the BBC that in October 2024, the Russian army suffered the largest monthly losses since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of our country. According to Radakin, in October, Russian troops lost an average of about 1,500 dead and wounded daily, and their total losses since February 2022 are approaching up to 700,000. He emphasized that the Russian people are paying an extraordinary price for the invasion of Ukraine. Russia about to lose 700,000 killed and wounded. This is the pain that the Russian people endure because of Putin's ambitions. I would actually argue here because they go voluntarily, they are offered money, they join the army, and that's it. No one forces them to go, in fact. The total losses of Russian forces in Ukraine amount to almost 50% of the original sentence. Russia will gain tactical and territorial benefits, and this puts pressure on Ukraine. He adds that Russia spends more than 40% of its public spending on defense and security. The New York Times, citing Ukrainian and American officials, writes that a 50,000-strong group of Russian and North Korean troops is preparing to launch a large-scale counteroffensive in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. According to U.S. officials, Russian troops are currently attacking Ukrainian positions in Kursk region with missile strikes and artillery fire, but they've not yet launched a large-scale offensive. Ukrainian officials said they expected such an attack, with the participation of North Korean troops. North Korean troops are currently training with Russian troops in the far western part of the Kursk region. But according to Ukrainian officials and our president, some North Korean troops have already participated in combat operations, and there have already been losses among them. Some U.S. military and intelligence officials have become more pessimistic about Ukraine's prospects, noting that Russia is steadily gaining ground both in the Kursk region and in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine's inability to address the critical issue of insufficient military personnel is partly the result of these failures. One Western official said anonymously that Ukraine's surprise invasion of Kursk region in August had weakened its forces across the eastern Ukraine battlefield, leaving it vulnerable to an offensive. But this official, as well as U.S. officials, say that Ukraine still has strong defenses in the Kursk region and may be able to hold these territories, at least for a while. Western and Ukrainian officials say the arrival of North Korean troops is a serious escalation after more than 2 years of war. According to U.S. officials, North Korea has sent more than 10,000 soldiers to fight for Russia in the Kursk region. These troops wear Russian uniforms and have been equipped by Moscow, but are likely to fight in their own separate units. Arguar reported that they are equipped with AK-12s, RPGs, night vision devices, and an average of 30 North Koreans have one translator to help them integrate into the Russian military system, if you can call it that. Ukrainian officials have stated that Moscow has supplied North Korean troops with machine guns, as well as sniper rifles, anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, meaning that they have everything they need to help the Russian military fight the defense forces. According to U.S. officials, Russia trained the North Koreans in artillery fire, basic infantry tactics, and, most importantly, trench clearing. These preparations indicate that at least part of the North Korean forces will be involved in frontal attacks on Ukrainian trench defenses. A Ukrainian official said, on condition of anonymity, that the North Korean troops were divided into an assault group and a support group that can be recaptured from Ukrainian forces, if it can be recaptured from Ukrainian forces. The Americans say Ukrainian troops will be difficult to dislodge, and that Russian and North Korean troops will likely suffer heavy losses similar to Russia's in the east of our country. U.S. and British military analysts estimate the current number of killed and wounded Russian servicemen at an average of more than 1,200 per day. The North Koreans will fight as light infantry without the use of armored vehicles, and the Ukrainian tactics have proven devastating to Russian troops, according to the New York Times. Nevertheless, if Russia gains momentum, it may not stop at its border, as journalists write, but try to push Ukrainian troops even further. It's unclear whether North Korean govt will allow long-term ops in Ukraine or if troops are only for Kursk region counteroffensive. Some U.S. officials believe that North Korea may order its troops to stop at the border while Russian troops advance deeper into Ukraine. U.S. defense officials said they did not know whether North Korea would send additional reinforcements. According to a senior Ukrainian official, Ukrainian intelligence predicted North Korea could send 100,000 troops. In general, regarding the reinforcements that Kim Jong-un could theoretically send to Vladimir Putin to support his efforts to occupy our country. The international community is still reacting to North Korean troops in the Kursk region is rather ambiguous. There is a reaction. Zelensky's words, there is a pool of countries that are reacting quite radically, there is a pool of countries that are reacting very mildly, and there are countries that have not reacted at all. In total, this makes, for example, the reaction of our international community, our friends and partners, insufficient to stop this, to call for something. Perhaps to change the minds and the way our partners think, to give more permission, to lift certain restrictions. But this did not happen. And Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un signed an agreement that they would provide each other with military forces in case of an attack on their territory. And so far the world is watching, but it is unclear what their reaction will be if these troops are deployed directly to the Ukrainian fronts. What changes if North Korean troops will be involved in battles against the defense forces is not really clear. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron will meet today the possibility of convincing the incumbent U.S. President Joe Biden to allow Ukraine to launch British-made Storm Shadow missiles against targets in Russia. This was reported by The Telegraph. According to the newspaper, London hopes that Biden will finally authorize long-range strikes on Russian territory. Kyiv has been seeking for several months now. The Telegraph's source in the British government, who has not been named, said the following: "We really want to make sure that we can make the most of the time between now and January 20th, which is when Donald Trump becomes officially president, and not just put everything on hold until the next administration." The debate over Ukraine launching Storm Shadow missiles deep into Russian territory has been going on for several months. Currently, Ukraine is allowed to use missiles on Russian territory only in limited cases, for example, to strike at military forces near the border, although the exact arrangements have never been made public. Our president has been calling for these strikes deep into Russian territory for several months now, and the Telegraph article says that if Ukraine gets permission for long-range Storm Shadow strikes before Donald Trump takes office, it will be much harder to cancel that permission. Another source said that Biden is expected to turn on the taps by handing over more financial aid to Ukraine in the weeks before he leaves the White House. Starmer and Macron are expected to discuss the future presidency of Donald Trump for the Middle East and the possibility of a trade war with Europe. As for the opening of the taps and more aid for Ukraine, things are not as simple and as clear and joyful as they might seem at first glance. Why? Because the financial assistance from the United States is kept at the same level, that is, it's approved, and the United States does not go beyond giving more or giving less. There are 10 billion left, of which 8 billion should go to some programs and 2 more to others. And these 10 billion should be distributed by the end of the current fiscal year, which means that if Joe Biden wants to give Ukraine a non-standard aid package, as he always does, 400 million every 2 or 3 weeks, but to allocate 3 billion at once, he will take these 3 billion from this balance. This means that in the coming months, Ukraine will not receive any aid, because it will simply not be there. For all the time that our friends and partners have been helping us, the aid for our country has been approved, and it cannot go lower, and it cannot go higher, because this money is laid down in advance in the fiscal year. That is, the budget is approved, and you cannot take something else from it. This aid has become stagnant. So when we talk about the United States being able to allocate more, they can allocate more in the short term, but in the long term, that is, by the end of the fiscal year, Ukraine may suffer from a lack of funding. Suddenly, of course, they hope that our European friends and partners know where to find additional money without having to take it from their budgets to cover this financial gap. But it's unlikely, so it should be taken in this context. It's not really good news at all. It's our usual routine. And it's better that the aid comes, again, for those 400 million. I would like more, but it's better than all at once, and then find yourself with nothing. So this is important. This is an important nuance that needs to be discussed and known so that later there will be no news that the United States has run out of aid. Instead of being stretched over the entire financial year. So at the very end of this news hour, I will remind you that Channel 24 has a fundraiser for UAH 380,000, and this money will be used to buy a Mercedes Sprinter for the Shaman Special Unit of the Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, a special unit that performs quite specific tasks. But they need the car anyway because it allows them to transport ammunition, to transport military, to transport food, in short, to use it for their needs. But most importantly, because it is a Mercedes Sprinter, it cannot be evacuated, and it can transport some specific things that Russians are unlikely to like. The collection hasn't really started not so long ago, but we've already collected 15% of the required amount. Grateful to you for joining all our meetings. Let me remind you that you can join by scanning the QR code that you see on your screens, or by visiting fund.24tv.ua. To make your contribution and see how many fees we have already closed with your help. Remember that there are no small donors. Every contribution you make to the jar brings the final amount closer to the final goal. In this case, the purchase of a car for our defenders.